I want to try to distinguish the difference between anterograde and retrograde amnesia. This lengthy anecdote about HM tells an interesting story. As you can read, HM cycled through his ownership of rifles and guns, forgetting that he had just described the guns that he had owned in a previous few sentences, going round and round, repeating the same topics essentially. This is a feature of anterograde amnesia. He's unable to form a memory for what he had just described. Incidentally, he did not own these guns at the time that he told the story about owning the guns. This is from his earlier youth, and it was a part of his long-term memory, but he got confused about the time period in which he owned those things. But his repeating himself, and at the bottom few sentences it says, on and on this went, cycling back and forth between a description of the rifles and description of the guns, until finally the researcher had to sort of throw him off to get him to stop repeating himself so much. You'll remember that Clive Waring, in speaking to his wife Deborah, could not remember what had just been discussed. That Adele, a family friend, was getting married in New Zealand. He couldn't retain any part of that conversation. And Deborah did not get exasperated because she knows that that's part of his condition. Sort of a similar situation in which a conversation is of extremely low quality because he could not remember what was being said, as was the case here with Henry Malazone, whose name we found out in 2008. A few features of anterograde. Working memory is not affected. Affects all modalities. It tends to spare general knowledge. Henry Malazone knew a lot of things about the world, as does Clive Waring, as he revealed in conversations about knowing things about Buckingham Palace, etc. And also spares performance. Performance, such as Clive's piano playing, was not affected in the least. Henry Malazone, you might remember, was able to trace a star in a mirror, and he got better at it day to day, but did not remember the experience of having traced that star. His physical performance was intact, as was Clive's physical performance. Now, a different sort of amnesia is retrograde. Basically, I have trouble remembering things from the past, and that may be from a narrow context. For example, in the video that follows this one, you'll see a bit of an indictment, a bit of a criticism of electroconvulsive therapy for depression, and that the patients have trouble remembering things from the period surrounding these deliberate electrocutions. Now, I happen to be a big believer in the role of ECT in relieving depressive symptoms. I think it works. Now, we don't know the exact mechanism. However, a side effect is that it's such a jarring experience to the brain that people do have trouble forming memories for the time period surrounding their electroconvulsive therapy. And you can see that in that 4-minute video produced by the BBC. In fact, there was a very famous person here in the United States, Kitty Dukakis, the former First Lady of Massachusetts, who described her ECT as being very helpful, but she couldn't remember events around the time of it. So the time span varies for retrograde amnesia, failing to remember things in the past. There is a defined time span often, like Kitty Dukakis' experience with losing her memory for the time of her electroconvulsive therapy. And it tends to spare overlearned information. So if I've got a very, very solid memory for something, whether it's semantic or episodic, that tends to be uninterrupted by whatever blow or whatever event may happen that has spawned this amnesia, this retrograde amnesia. And what are some examples of that? As you'll see in the video clip that follows this one, the woman had ECT for depression, and she describes not remembering many of her child rearing years when her children were young. So it affected that defined time span, as number 2 says. You might remember Troy Aikman, the Dallas Cowboys quarterback, the last guy to win a Super Bowl for the Cowboys. He had a rather awful concussion during an NFC championship game against the 49ers that put him into the Super Bowl. He's taken to the hospital, visited by Jimmy Johnson as coach, and he asked Jimmy, "Did we win?" And Jimmy says, "Yeah, we won, and you played a great game." 5 minutes go by with a conversation. Troy asks him again, "Did we win the game?" He was so affected by that concussion that he couldn't form memories for the game that had just happened. Now, that's a very defined time span, but nonetheless, that's a feature of retrograde amnesia. Something caused a lack of congealing of that memory that caused Troy not to be able to function and store that memory for that duration of time. Now, thankfully, he's been spared, apparently. Troy is obviously very high functioning there on ESPN and formerly on Fox, but other athletes have not been so lucky, of course. So if you'll indulge me in figure 6.4 here, evidence of temporally limited retrograde amnesia, failure to remember things from the past, in patients who have gone this therapy for depression. Before and after a series of treatments, 20 people were asked to recall information about TV programs that aired for just one season around that time. Shown here is a graph of the median numbers of facts recalled. Before ECT, patients showed a normal forgetting curve. Their best recall was for shows from the most recent time period, and their poorest recall was for shows from the most remote time period. After ECT, selective impairment occurred in the recall of shows from the most recent time period. So as you can see, this is going back a ways. So this ECT causes some period-specific amnesia because one could argue that the memories sort of fail to congeal because they've been interrupted by the electrocution, and in Troy Aikman's case, by the blow to the head. And here's one take-home message. Jim McGaw, who's still with us, noted that studies of amnesic patients also tell us something about memory consolidation, a process originally proposed a century ago. Basically, blows to the head disrupt this process, causing newly learned information to be lost. And some of McGaw's work suggests an important role for the amygdala, a structure we discussed earlier in memory consolidation. And we'll speak of him next chapter. But basically, if I don't give my brain the chance to have a physical congealing of sorts, like Jell-O in the refrigerator, then in that case, that memory may not form. And it could be for something incidental like TV shows, or something rather fundamental like some child rearing experiences, or in Troy Aikman's case, whether or not they just won the game that put him into the Super Bowl in that given year.